Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang berbahagia Prof. Datin Sri Dr. Suhaizah Hanim binti Datuk Muhammad Zailani, Director Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, Universiti Malaya Kuala Lumpur. Our guest speaker, Dr. Sharifah Fatimah Zahrah binti Said Hussein, Assistant Professor at International Islamic University, Malaysia. All participants this morning. Allow me to introduce myself. Myself is Nur Hafizah Muhammad Harith from the Faculty of Empirical Science and Policy Study. All right, I'll be your moderator for today. I would like to welcome all participants to Ungku Aziz Thoughts and Public Policy Public Lecture Series 2, 2023, with the title Families in Poverty, a Sociological Perspective, exclusively organized by Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, Universiti Malaya Kuala Lumpur. Before we start, let me introduce our guest speaker of today. Dr. Sharifah Fatimah Al-Zahra Said Hussein is an assistant professor at Abdul Hamid Abdul Sulaiman Kuliah of Islamic Rival Knowledge and Human Sciences in International Islamic University, Malaysia, Gombak. She obtained her PhD in sociology from Victoria University of Wellington. She is an active in research project and consultancy at national and international level. Among the list, she led project on socio-economic report of COVID-19, social cohesion and community resilience with Universiti Petra Malaysia and the United Nations Development Programme. She also holds a few projects in especially in fundamental research grant scheme, which under Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia. She's involved in many national and international community projects in area of menstrual hygiene practices, social entrepreneurships among women of different ethnic groups, and she led project on sociology of marriage, family, and kinship, sponsored by United States of America. She's an active writer, presenters in international conferences, and speakers in forums at the national and international mass media, and many more. I think we are here today to hear her insights and perspective on families in poverty, especially from the perspective of sociological discipline. And I would very much, very happy to be with you, all of you here today. And hopefully we'll be feeling more informed and inspired by how families in poverty, right, I think from the perspective of sociology. I think before we get started, I want to remind all of you, right, to switch off your mic or audio and refrain yourself from any distraction during the lecture. For format for today's lectures, I think we will have time for Q&A session at the end of the talk. So please hold your questions until the end. I think without further ado, I think please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest speakers, Dr. Sharifah Fatimah Al-Zahra binti Said Hussein from International Islamic University, Malaysia. All yours, Doctor. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Nur Hafizah Muhammad Harith. First of all, I would like to thank Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies for inviting me here to share a little bit on families in poverty from a sociological perspective. Honorable guests and participants or listeners today, I'm really excited about today's session. I just want to, I suppose, briefly introduce the session. The lecture today is more of a framing of, so to introduce the perspective of looking at poverty through a sociological lens, focusing specifically on the family institution. So we will start off just by trying to frame the issue on hand, but then we will open up the space for you to ask more questions, and we can look at more specific examples perhaps, or of interest, or perhaps even engage in discussions at the very end. Okay, allow me to share my screen. Okay, I'm Fatimah Latas. So Fatimah is fine. You can call me Fatimah, or Dr. Fatimah says okay. I think when we talk about poverty, and Ungku Aziz Center have also conducted several discussions on this and lectures discussing poverty. A lot of the discussions always begin with defining poverty, and that's a pertinent and very important part of talking about poverty is how do we start with the definitions of poverty and what do we include and what we don't include. I will not get too deep into that because I think there's been a wide availability of definitions. Generally, we look at issues relating to absolute poverty and relative poverty. These are the general measurements of poverty that's usually based on income or material measurements. Okay, and recently, Malaysia's introduced the multidimensional poverty index, which is another measure. This is outside of my range of expertise because I'm a sociologist, not an economist. So we will try to keep at things. Okay, so I think definitions of poverty and how we use them and how we operationalize them to give us an idea of what poverty looks like is very important because that's where it starts. And I will use whatever that's already available in terms of the data set to share with all of you. So we keep consistent at that. So we know that as a country, if you just watch the previous video, I'll give a I know that the previous lecture, the first lecture in 2023 by Ungku Aziz Center was by Prof. Champuri, and it was gives us a good idea of what poverty looks like in Malaysia currently. So you can watch that video after this if you're interested. So we know that Malaysia has been progressing in terms of its reduction of poverty rates. So over the last few decades, we've seen a good decline. So that's a positive thing for our country. However, with the pandemic COVID-19, we see some negative impacts of the pandemic on people's livelihoods and also people's experience of poverty. And we know that even among the M40 group, a significant amount has dropped into the bottom cohort or the bottom line or have gone into poverty and all are very close to poverty. And we know that because it is affected by the pandemic, economists say that this would mean that it will take some time, but it will recover again. So what we know now at the moment, I am sharing with you the rates of poverty that we have. So what we can see here is that, well, we have quite a low number or a significantly low percentage of poverty, and especially hardcore poverty. We know that some states in our country experiences or have higher rates of poverty. So this gives us a quick idea of what it looks like for Malaysia. So while Malaysia is going through rapid urbanization, we still have rural and urban divide. That means the conditions of life in the rural areas and the conditions of life in the urban areas are different. And because of urbanization, meaning people move away from rural areas to go to urban centers, either for education, to access better employment opportunities, improving quality of life, for example, this shifts or changes the social climate in our country. So we have two visuals now or two contexts of poverty. So this makes Malaysia quite unique. So we still have incidents and cases of rural poverty where poverty looks a certain way and is experienced in a certain way. We also have incidents and a growing number of urban poor. Now, urban poverty does not necessarily look like rural poverty. So urban poverty is another area that we can look at and understand how urbanization and living within cities look like. So in this context, a relative poverty view is probably better because we can see the differences among the poor. The other trend that we see in our country, Malaysia, is that we have a growing gap of inequality. So this, while we are reducing in terms of poverty rates, and that is of course affected by different things and different measurements, we know that there's also a growing inequality gap, and that's something that we need to think about and look at as well. So we know that trends of poverty going down, even though we have reviewed the poverty line and still is contested, okay, and we are now using multidimensional index to measure poverty in Malaysia. We also know that there's a divide between the rural and urban areas. So this sort of sets a small stage for our conversation today. Now, more often than not, when we hear discussions about poverty or when we listen to conversations about poverty, whether it is in the academic side of things or whether it is in the implementation of things and the policy side of things, a lot of the conversation is statistical in nature, meaning we're looking at numbers and we're looking from an economic perspective. So when that happens, they are very important and they're very necessary because there's data, the statistical data helps us identify things in numbers, and we are able to see vulnerabilities within our social context. So we know which groups require more attention and whether poverty is reducing or expanding, and where are the potential gaps and who may be affected by these gaps. But this very statistical way of looking at things, and this very economic perspective sometimes lacks something. It misses a few things, which is it misses that lived reality of people. What do people's lives look like, right? So when we're looking at numbers, sometimes we tend to miss out the more human side of things, which is a very important part. So we need to get into the messy part, right? When we talk about human lives, they're not just numbers, they're not just statistical, um, they're not just statistical measurements, right? Or equations for us to look at, but we live as human beings. So we recognize that human lives are a web of connections, and we trying to figure out human lives and social connectedness is a messy project, and it's very qualitative in nature as well. So this calls for a different added perspective, not to remove away or to move away from the statistics or to move away from the economic perspective, but to add on, to add another layer of perspective so that we can understand not only from the statistics, but also from the social context on looking at things from the human side of things. So a lot of the measurements usually look at monetary or income. So when we study poverty, sometimes we're focusing on income, and income is a very powerful indicator for measuring poverty. And it's really important to look at income because a lot of the times from looking at the income of people, we can see how other parts of their lives are affected. And it does affect people's level of income, does affect their quality of life and their ability to access different parts of the society. So we must focus on the income. But at the same time, apart from the monetary or income, non-monetary measures or non-income based measurements are also important when we want to look at poverty rates, but also when we want to look at poverty threats, meaning who's vulnerable, what makes somebody more vulnerable. So when we say non-monetary measures, we're looking at many different things. We're looking at access to education, we're looking at familial context, we're looking at ethnicity, we're looking at perhaps even locality where people live, the neighborhood that they're coming from. So the more human side of things. And we know that poverty is not just something that happens randomly. We know that across different segments of society, there are certain variables that make people more vulnerable to poverty or makes it harder for them to get out of poverty. So we're talking about social mobility. So among the variables that affects poverty is ethnicity. And we know that there is a different ethnic divide in terms of poverty in Malaysia. Gender, of course, we can talk about the feminization of poverty, meaning how women are often more likely to be those in poverty. a lot of the work that women do and also gender roles that women play make it harder for them to get out of poverty as well. And then we also have to, today, we're going to focus on how family structure or familial life is affecting or experiencing poverty. And then, of course, parental level of education. So this is also relating to the familial structure. So all of these examples will have an impact and also may keep certain groups of people within poverty groups or in the experience of poverty. Okay. So we move on to our conversation on families and why families are important. Why do we want to start looking at families first? Or why is it important for us to consider a familial lens in trying to understand poverty? So poverty is usually looked at a macro lens sometimes. So we look at the larger context. Okay, we may think about jobs and employment, whether people are getting access to education to allow them to get employment. We may look at minimum wages and so on. But I want to steer us towards family because I think while family might look like a loose institution, or it may seem like somewhat a personal institution, the family institution is really the first institution a child grows up in. So we can start the conversation by looking at the children first. So the situation of the family pre-conception, before a child is conceived, while in gestation, while the mother is pregnant with the child, and of course, as the child grows up, affects the chances of the child. The life chances of the child, the state of the child, not only in terms of their economics, but also their potential life outcomes in terms of their health as well, access to education and their ability to get quality education. I'll try to explain each concept briefly. I'll try to keep to the time, inshallah, so that we can see a picture of how it affects one another. Okay, so when a couple, for example, in a traditional sense, may get married, and in the context of poverty, it may not even look in the traditional stereotypical life route of marriage. It may be that we can see generational examples of teenage pregnancies, and this happens a lot more for those in poverty as well than those who are not in poverty. So if we just start from the conception to through gestation and birth, we can see examples of number one, nutrition of the fetus as the fetus grows in the body of the mother, right? Number two is the mortality rate of infant and the mother. And we know that all of these three things are affected by poverty levels. So if the child starts out with a mother who is in poverty, the likelihood of these outcomes being more negative is higher for the child. So even from the very beginning, we can see that. And that's definitely familial related issues. And then we can also look at childhood outcomes and how a child grows up in that kind of setting, whether they are living in a family complete with two sets of parents or not, okay? The parental marriage status, okay, whether the parents are married to each other or not. And we know that single mothers in Malaysia are more likely to be in poverty, and a lot more women remain single parents within the ages of 30 to 49. And this is really a reproductive age when they are raising children, and also when mothers have to do the most amount of care work within the family. So that takes us to the next point, which is the amount of work that's done in the household. So we talk about it, or we use the term division of labor, how we divide work in the house, right? While the work that we do outside of the house is paid, right? There's the amount of monetary payment that's compensated by our labor. But the work that we do at home, which is usually care work, like cleaning the house, taking care of children, taking care of elderly family members or sick family members, these are typically unpaid work. But this work is necessary and it's what runs our society. Without people who do this unpaid care work, our society cannot run. Okay, but in the context of those families in poverty, their access to public services, such as ability to send children to childcare, is much lower, and they're likely to have a lower quality childcare for their children. So as a mother who may more likely be single mother, raising a family or children in poverty, her ability to access good quality childcare is much less, right? And at the same time, these mothers would have to manage raising the children and also going to work at the same time with little support because she's the only parent or only adult raising these children. And the data tells us also that mothers are also, or single mothers are more likely to do low paid jobs or minimal paid jobs and work in shifts. That means their job is not permanent, okay? It's a bit more precarious. She may not be receiving privileges such as having leave, medical leave, and so on. So this puts her in a very tricky situation. So there's a research by Zahrah in 2022 that finds that it's harder for mothers to get out of poverty if she's already a single mother because of these circumstances. So in poverty, she's less likely to be able to access the services that she needs, which is to send her children to childcare, which is something that seems very taken for granted or simple. Okay, so we've covered nutrition, we've covered public service or example of public service, and public service could also include education for the children, where the children goes to school in. If I can just share briefly, I was doing this part of my research at the PPR in Klang Valley. We were interviewing the children, not relating to urban poverty per se, but more to my research on period poverty or menstrual poverty. But what we notice is that in certain areas or certain PPR where children would go to the nearest public school near their PPR area, their housing area, and unfortunately, when they go to the school, there is an idea that's attached to the school, whether the school is a good school or the school is a bad school. So in one of the PPR areas, I interviewed these young girls. I found something very interesting because none of the girls had any aspiration. I'll talk a little bit more about aspiration. No true ambition or dream for their future. And I always share this because they don't see a lot of things around them that inspires them to dream or to aspire for something more. But what I also found was that all of them told me that we don't go to a good school. So they believe that they went to a school that's not good, that does not provide quality education. So this is a naughty school. So it's a label, it's a stereotype that they have about their school, and they believe that I don't go to a good school. But it wasn't their choice. They went to the school by virtue of living in that area, and there's no other choice to go to a different school. So a very small number of children in that area might have managed to get out from the area by going to a, sorry, what's the word? A special school. Sorry, I can't figure out the word now. But basically, only a small portion of the children there at secondary school level escapes the setting. But all of them feel that they've gone or they have been sent to or they go to a school that does not provide them a future. So that relates also to the neighborhood that a child grows up in. And neighborhood becomes very important because number one, children don't choose the neighborhood, and including family members, also other family members, including the adults in the family, whether there are higher crime rates, right? Whether there are better access to parks where they can play. And play is a very important part of growing up for children, also relating to their ability to aspire and imagine a future because the surrounding matters. So the infrastructure of the area also matters. There's a recent report by Khazanah Research Institute also on the impact and sizing of houses among the urban poor in Malaysia. So that's a very interesting report demonstrating how important the infrastructure around us affects our quality of life. We spoke also about the marital status of the parents, especially on the mothers, but the other one is also the role of fathers. So one is whether or not fathers are available to raise children, because active and present fathers are related to better outcomes in children, right? So if mothers are single mothers, then we know that perhaps there is no father figure that playing the parental role. And at the same time, we may also understand that in lower income families where parents are doing minimum paid jobs, more often than not, they're doing multiple jobs. So they're not just doing one job, they're doing two jobs. And this relates to the next point, which is time, or the availability of time to spend with family and to raise children. So time spent with family is very much important in the quality of family life that they have, whether families can resolve conflict with each other. Do they have time to go through that? Do they have time to watch their children? Do they have time to raise their children? So a lot of studies on child development and so on focuses on how important it is for parents to spend time with children. But when time is taken away because of income or because of poverty, then we take something else away. So we can see like a lot of these things add on to each other and becomes a really messy pit where there's a lot of variables that come to play and a lot of negative effects that they do not add to one another, but they take away from one another. That's why it becomes very complicated to look at issues relating to social mobility when we talk about familial poverty, and why it's important to look at poverty not just from an individual perspective, or when we use the term household, it's also very sterile, right? But when we say family, we can see people, we can see roles, we can see interactions between people, symbols that are important. So we look at family from a poverty perspective, or we look at poverty from a familial perspective, sorry, then we can see a somewhat more human side of things and how real these things are. Okay, I want to share an excerpt which really, I think, really hits the spot, I suppose, to show us how families in poverty experiences life. And I'm not sure who the participants are, but given that this is a public lecture, I suppose we come from different spaces, and a lot of us that may be listening here, we might come from middle or upper class families or experiencing middle or upper class lives, and we have access to these spaces. So some days we wake up and feel like, oh, I'm not having a good day because my car broke down, or tire puncture, or something happens, right? But this excerpt is really interesting because it says low income families laugh at what middle class families consider nuances that could ruin a perfect day. Okay. According to disadvantaged populations, a car breaking down, at least we have a car that can break, right? Or a child getting sick. These are things that typically make our day difficult, or we find that it is a difficult day, right? To go through our lives because the child is sick or something. But that's nothing, or that's so small in comparison to not knowing whether you can come home that day, right? Whether or not there's going to be electricity at your house or not. So even the very basic things are not certain. You're not sure whether your house is going to get locked and so on. So whether you and your family will have a place to lay your heads at night. So the experience of poverty as a family is not just waiting at the end of the month for a minimal income, it's everyday experience. And within every day, there are multiple distress, multiple experiences of distress, and sometimes also microaggressions. So I introduce this idea, or I bring together this idea of this normalized distress and microaggressions that people in poverty experience, and we may miss out when we don't look at the human side of things, when we perhaps only focus on more on the numbers, and we forget how people experience poverty. the general public view on poverty has always been that the poor people are lazy, right? They're not, they have an attitude problem, or they're not doing enough to elevate themselves out of poverty. But sometimes we miss out on the lived realities of those who are poor, and also what life looks like, right? So we must consider these things and how real these are in terms of lived experience. So even though many families in poverty experience a sense of distress, this is normalized because it happens a lot. It happens on a daily basis where their environment, like I said before, maybe the neighborhood is not safe where they live, right? If they are homeless, for example, the experience of homelessness is a constant process. For example, in contexts where people do not have homes, they are constantly on edge or careful to consider whether they're safe or not, right? You can't shut your door and close it for safety and security. There are also jobs in which a lot of the minimal paying jobs are dehumanized jobs, meaning the work that they do not elevate their sense of human, okay? And responding to or getting help through the welfare system can also be a difficult process that sometimes is dehumanizing, unfortunately. So this everyday experience that happens a lot, not including how people perceive the poor on a day-to-day basis, including children. So there's a lot of reports as well how children are sometimes isolated in school from friends because of the socioeconomic demarcation. For example, we know that children sometimes can tell that their friends are not coming from the socioeconomic income, and some bullying happen within the different socioeconomic groups. So this everyday experience of distress and microaggression is related to feelings of hopelessness. And sometimes that relates to abuse of illegal drugs or substance abuse. That then adds on to the challenges that people in poverty face. So it's really a lot of different things coming together that does not provide a lot of hope and a lot of positive view towards what can happen in the future for those who are living in poverty. So we get a more human perspective here by understanding questions that are more symbolic, right? A lot of the times when we publish research or we talk about policies, sorry, when we talk about policies, we don't look at symbolic parts of life, but a sociological perspective allows us to entertain and also to engage in the study of and also the perspective where symbols matter because it affects people's life in a real way. It's not just experiences that do not affect people's lives. So when we talk about symbols here in the context of poverty, we may be looking at questions of dignity, questions of deservingness, right? Whether people who are in the B40 deserve to get support, right? So these questions of deservingness are also the everyday experience of those in poverty. I'd like to share another experience while we were doing field work of people we were interviewing who were in poverty. So I've shared this experience before on a different platform as well. When we arrived or when I arrived at a particular respondent's house, the first thing they like to do is to try to explain to me where they got the items from. I'm just a researcher. I'm not really there to give aid or to provide social welfare and things like that. But just as a researcher arriving at their house, the first instance is usually them explaining to me, doctor, the reason why I have TB is because this person gave me this. I got it from a gift. This person gave me this because they felt that I was going to judge them, that they have acquired things. And so that question of deservingness and that symbol of deservingness affects them all the time in terms of having to explain themselves to a stranger. Practically, I'm a stranger who's a researcher as to why they have items, because being poor entails, unfortunately, culturally, we believe that you don't deserve to have things because you're supposed to be poor. So this public view and stereotype, or what we call stigma, makes it also a very important part of their lived experience, and also whether or not they are going to get support and whether or not they are going to get help from others around them, whether through official organizational channels or through unofficial channels, so including, for example, NGOs. So this idea that our society has of the poor and what we want or what we expect poor people to look like or what poverty to look like affects also how we practice, for example, charity, how we think about social financing and who deserves support and who deserves help. Because these things are happening in the back of our heads as we're doing things, as we are making decisions for people. So the question of stigma and symbols are not just things for us to put aside and for us not to discuss. We must also consider how this affects policymakers, researchers, people who are making decisions to support and elevate people out of poverty. And also how children are growing up in poverty within families, growing up with sense of hopelessness or sense of being stigmatized constantly and how they are responding to that. These are really important tools or lenses for us to look at, despite it being very qualitative in nature. So the human side of things really must be incorporated alongside the more numerical side of things or the measurement side of things. Okay, I think we have looked at how things work in terms of the lens of looking at poverty from the familial perspective. Sometimes these discussions may be a bit depressing or difficult to have, but it also means that acknowledging that there are different lenses and there are missing gaps in terms of how we view and how we address issues of poverty to ensure social mobility means that we can come up with better ways of doing things. It empowers us to look at the solutions in hopefully a more holistic manner. So I suppose some of the suggestions that I have for future outlook in response to families in poverty and in looking at social mobility or getting to zero poverty is number one is acknowledging that while we have solutions, we must consider that the familial institution is a really important institution to look at when we have a multidimensional perspective of poverty, so that we're not just looking at indicators of education, for example, and health, but we're also looking at the family setting, and that allows us to see how different variables are affecting, particularly if we want to get children out of poverty. So this definitely would have us think about a whole system approach, and it's very sociological in nature for us to think of things as a whole system, that they're all connected to one another. So we're not just looking at employment and income rates, we're also looking at how different institutions in the society will have an impact to one another. So it's not just necessarily a top-down approach, but also figuring out context, right? Whether it's within a rural setting, whether it is an urban setting, which part of the country are we looking at, which ethnicities are involved. So we must consider all of these things. Number three is, of course, by identifying or being able to see that family involves care work, it involves access to public services, involving time and these things, we are able to identify points in which we can reduce vulnerabilities because we can pinpoint some of the areas in which, okay, this is the kind of support that's available in terms of what we can do in those areas and who may be involved and who are affected by those particular items. And then, of course, we must reconsider what social mobility looks like in Malaysia. So I know that in 2019, KRI released a report on social mobility in Malaysia to study. We don't have a lot of studies on social mobility in Malaysia. I think Dr. Hafizah is also working on something relating to this, right? Maybe we can hear a little bit more on that as well. Social mobility in Malaysia is related to access to education, especially for the B40, in order for B40 to escape that group, for them to be elevated to the next level for their children. Education is a good variable, meaning ensuring that children stay in school means that they are more likely to do better than their parents, especially if they come from the B40. We also know that ethnicity plays a really important role in social mobility. And ethnicity is not really a choice that anybody makes. We're born into a particular ethnic group, and this also depends on our familial status and familial level. And we also know that this has to do with gender. And when we talk about gender again, I mentioned just now on the feminization of poverty, a lot of the context of gender and how poverty affects women and why it is harder for women to get out of poverty has to do with gender division of work at home and access to care and childcare, or access to ability to send people who need care to better care systems, right? Better childcare services, better care for elderly, for example, or in ensuring our society gives value to care work, right? So that women who need to do care work are not being punished for doing care work. So when we talk even about gender, it's still very much related to the first institution, which is the family. Okay, I think we will stop. I will stop here with my lecture to open up space for us to perhaps discuss things or look into more specific things. I will pass it back to you, Dr. Fiza.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sharifah Fatimah, for that, I think, very interesting point of looking at poverty from the perspective of, I think, sociological perspective in context of, I think, family, isn't it? I do agree. I think a point that you mentioned where in context of sociological perspective, of family context of within family context of poverty, we cannot measure things that we cannot measure, like economics who look at I think a measurable outcome or a measurable perspective of poverty, where income, as you said, is very, I think, significant, all right, in differentiating for those who are poor and non-poor. But in context of sociological perspective, looking at the family household, as you said, the dimensions of the demographic background, of the family household or households who are poor, I think that's really important, as you said, to describe, how people, I think, live in poverty. I think the human, as you said, the human aspect of especially the unmeasurable aspect of living in poverty and the life experience of people, or the livelihood of people, I think is something that where need to be studied, provide insight, as you said, where I think that's the strength of sociology that looks into this, insight into the life experience of the poor people.
And it really helps us answer a lot of questions too, right? A lot of questions as to why, even after a lot of effort and initiative to end poverty or to, elevate people out of poverty, that we still can't, because perhaps that it is missing that qualitative aspect, right?
Yeah, that's, I think, the strength of sociology, that look into the insight through qualitative perspective, which I think that shows, in-depth, analysis and how they experience it. So I think I do, I think, when we look at that from that lens of the life experience, then you can see there are a lot of things that maybe some economics will not discover. How do they live in the poor environment? There are many factors contributing to poverty. Right. There's a question from Chia Kwan Chia. Yes, you want to write on the chat box, or you want to on your mic, Chia Kwan Chia?
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Yeah, I'll ask directly. Hi, good
Yeah,
morning,
sure.
doctor. I'm Chia from
Yeah, sure.
Education Faculty UM.
Yeah.
I need to declare first,
Yeah.
I have no emotional sentience bias toward the question I'm going to ask next, and I have no knowledge family planning in different religion. So
Yeah.
I have two questions. First is I have no data to support this question. It's just observations. Why those who are in the urban poor family, they tend to have more children compared to those who are not in the poverty category. This is from my observation in Kuala Lumpur. And second is after 60 years of affirmative action in higher educations, what do you think that how it have helped to reduce the poverty issue in Malaysia? Because currently the affirmative action is one model fixed to all, and it is not targeted directly to the underprivileged who are really needs category. So these are my two questions.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chia. All right. Is that okay, Dr. Fatimah?
Yes, I will attempt to answer the
Yeah,
questions that I think I have answers to. Of course, I don't have answers to all questions. I will try to attempt the first question first on family planning and also the number of children that people have. And this is often a question that gets asked a lot as to why those particularly in poverty have more children, for example. And I think Mr. Chair also highlighted particularly on the urban poor. I don't have the most recent numbers, okay, but when we talk about questions of reproduction and family planning, there are a lot of social factors also to why people have children. Of course, I know you started the question with no emotional, I suppose, background or emotional stance as well as religious knowledge, because I think you have an idea that religion, for example, or culture has to do with people's decision to have children and to have the amount of children that they have. We also have questions relating to education and in particular knowledge about reproductive health and also family planning. So we know that there are cases in which people do not know about family planning or do not fully understand family planning, not just from a cultural or religious standpoint, where, for example, they are not aware of what is available and how to access these family planning options. So it may be lack of information and lack of knowledge about family planning itself. It may be based on preference to have more children because perhaps from their belief that having more children is a positive outcome, is something to look up to. And it also may be that, for example, we have incidents and cases whereby women, for example, are fearful of using family planning for fear of how it may affect their marriage, particularly their relationships with their husband. So these are some of the reasons why we see these cases. So it could include access to healthcare as well and access to the family planning itself and whether they know that they can access these things. So these are some of the reasons why we see these numbers. But I don't know what the recent numbers are, but I know that there are people who are working on this and researching family planning, and especially in the on the poverty side of things. Why it's important is because when people have children too close together, it is also in terms of health-wise dangerous for the mother. Sometimes mothers do not know this. So it's not just important in terms of the management of their family finances and how they live their life, but it is also health related for the mothers when the children are too close to each other. So this is one of the highlights for 2023 actually among researchers and also policymakers and activists working on issues relating to women. On the second point on affirmative action relating to education, I think I will need to answer a little bit more questions also. I have not done a lot of research on this, nor have I a lot of information in particular, but we know that in terms of division within the different socioeconomic income, this is actually where sociology can come in. So in sociology, we have different perspectives that can tell us that providing education, as in giving access to public schools and public education alone, is not fully sufficient to elevate. So when we say access to education, at the governmental level, for example, it's providing access to schools that are nearby, ensuring that there are teachers, syllabus is accessible, children can go to school and get books and things like that. But whether or not a child does well in education also relates to other what we call capitals or other access that help them in their life. For example, having access to social capital. Social capital here can include parents who can read and write, right? So having parents who can read and write actually would help a child do better at school, because more likely than not, educated parents are more likely to teach their children their ABCs, to help them with their homework because they know and they understand. So while this might not have a lot to do with the school, these background things that a child has or lacks affects their ability to succeed in school. So children who might not have started school with parents who have already introduced them to their ABCs and they can write and count, they may have a harder time at school. And this is not just something that's experienced at one level. Sometimes this adds on to each other as the child grows up. So for example, in their first year of school, they don't make it too well because they didn't start with parents who had already taught them a lot of things about being at school. So it's their first introduction to their ABCs and writing, and they've never had training to write, for example, because there's no pen and paper at home. There's no table sometimes at home where they can do writing. So it's not common to them. So in the first year of school, they don't do too well. So unfortunately, in some schools or in many schools, children who don't do too well in year one goes to year two, where they are at the back class, right? So this adds on. And children who are usually in the back class are also children who are not seen as intelligent or smart. And sometimes they also take on this identity that I'm not a smart kid. Just like my example just now of the young girls who felt that they don't go to a good school. They're not smart children. They're naughty kids, or this is a naughty school, so therefore no future. So you can see it sort of adds on. So it's not just about the quality of education that happens at school, but also other things that may affect the child in terms of their access to education. That's one example of social capital. So maybe they don't have parents who can read, but they have neighbors or teachers that can add to their social capital that would support them. So even though their mom cannot help them at home or their dad cannot help them at home, they have a really caring teacher who's willing to go outside of her working hours to support this child. So this child would have an extra social capital. So then we can also look at other forms of capital, such as cultural capital or material capital that can assist a child in terms of their educational outcome. But I think perhaps there are also other ways to look at this. But I don't think I can answer it well because it's really not my area of expertise to look into what are the outcomes of affirmative action. So just to sort of propose a sociological lens to the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for your response. I think there are more questions coming in the chat box. Yeah. Allow me to read our question from Saja Othman. Right. Her question is, since Malaysia is rapidly becoming an aged nation, how will poverty impact the familial institution in terms of caring for older adults at home, considering the needs of other family members to go out to work? Yeah, very interesting.
Very
question.
interesting,
Very interesting. That's
question.
what we are experiencing now, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, and I
To
think
you, Dr. Sharifah.
yeah. This is such a good question because I mentioned care work just now, but we always focus a lot more care work on child rearing and child care. But we've come to a point in our nation where, because of number one, urbanization, access to education for women, so In Malaysia, something positive is that access to education for women and boys are equitable, meaning unlike a lot of other countries where usually we don't see girls having good access to education in relative to boys, but in Malaysia, our girls are actually in school and they actually perform better, and there are more girls than boys that are in school and performing better at tertiary level. But this means also that unlike traditional times, now we have a new generation of women, perhaps my generation or the Hamida's generation, right, where we are working women. So lives are slightly different as to the generation before us, where women would stay at home and care for children and care for the elderly, and that's part of their life process. But there's a bit of a disruption here when we give access to girls to go to school and they have a career, which is something good and something positive. There's a change in terms of our culture and how we live our lives. So now these women, me included, become career women, where in terms of childcare, if we are able to access care that is affordable or that's quality care within our income group, we can send our children outside of home for care of children. But as Malaysia becomes an aging nation with higher population of people within the elderly age, then we have another caring role there's a gap. And we can see that happening really rapidly with different issues coming up. For example, elderly abuse or elderly neglect, right? But it's also a very real reality for cases where there is not elderly neglect. And we're just looking at middle income first, right? Even for middle income, upper income women to access care for elderly outside of the home is challenging because there's not a lot of available quality care. So we are really just starting as a nation to recognize that we need to ensure that there is access to care for elderly parents that is dignified, and it is also quality care, right? At the moment, the current climate is that when we talk about elderly care outside of the home, we think about it as something that's negative because we're thinking about abandoned parents, abandoned elderly. We're not looking at it from the same perspective we would look at, for example, childcare in terms of quality care that's given to enhance the quality of life of the elderly or the children in this context. So it's still quite far away from even looking at people in poverty. So we know that in the PPR areas, we have a significant percentage of elderlies who are living alone. And they are without a lot of support. So they're living on, for example, assistance and support by JKM. That's in terms of their income or in terms of financial or material needs. But in terms of care needs, most of them are without support from their families or support from others. So that for elderly who are isolated or maybe do not have support. But for those who may have support, how do we ensure now that the people who can support the elderly are supporting the elderly without it having negative repercussions for the next generation, right? So if we're looking at a single mother now taking care of her children, so where she can perhaps send them to childcare and go to work, but if she has another elderly person for her to care for, then she cannot work because there's no accessible conditions. So I suppose this is the problem that we have. And I don't have the solution to this, but it's a problem that we need to talk about and we need to highlight. The other thing I think is important for us to connect the dots is the issue of KWSP, right? We know that if we look at life expectancy, women live longer than men, but also women are more likely to have diseases in older age more often than men. And they are more likely not to have savings in their KWSP to support them in their elder age. So even though they might not be in poverty in their younger years, but towards the end of their life, it may be that they are put into poverty. And based on our tradition or our cultural understanding of mothers being carers, and mothers are the ones that take care of others, we also have an unfortunate trend where women give out their KWSP savings to their children upon retirement. So not to wait, say, for example, to sustain their lives in the long run, but to spend all of the money in such a short period of time to disburse and distribute. We're not thinking about how they may care for themselves or how that saving is supposed to support them in their elder age. So then we have another issue that's supposed to be connected, and we must think of them as together in terms of how our safety nets of the KWSP is supposed to sustain and support those who are aging or elderly in terms of their life. So these are pertinent questions that we must talk about, and we must continue to discuss so that we don't, it doesn't just go and become a gap. It's going to be very hard for us to solve those problems later on.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Dr. Sharifah,
Mm.
I think in my opinion, I think we should have a policies on this. I think as we are going towards age population, I think it's right time for us to look at this and have a policy and how to deal with this in the future, because I think we're going to have more Malaysian aging in the next 20 years from now. Are we ready?
If I'm not mistaken, in 2050, we're going to be a super age.
Yes.
Super age nation.
I think it's very high time, I think, to look at this and come up with policy addressing this. All right, thank you very much on your response. I think we have a few more questions here. I think from Muhammad Sharimin Shahdan, right? And then he said, okay, resonate with the questions about children and poverty. From Islamic point of view, children viewed as rizki, yeah? And we believe that children are born with rizki of their own. But at the same time, more children means more mouth to feed. It is a paradox between beliefs and life reality. How should we address the issue of family planning in poverty? Are we suggesting that the poor family are not entitled to have children? Or should it be decided on how many children are allowed to have it if you have this certain level of income? And then he said, I don't know, is this even, I don't know that this is even a question. All right. Okay, that will be some, I think, comment made by Sharimin. You want to respond to that?
It's a moral question, isn't it? It's such a tough question also, but we've seen what we can do is perhaps just like briefly look at what has been done in other countries, right? We know that population and demographics are also important in terms of reproductive measurements, right? We don't want our reproductive levels or fertility levels are reducing. And we know that a lot more developed countries who have negative fertility trends, which is also dangerous in those countries, right? So when we're thinking about making policies like this at the national level, it's not really something that we can do simply, and we must really consider what are the potential implications. So fertility trends in Malaysia is going down, right? And there are examples of countries where fertility trends have gone negative, meaning that for them it's very dangerous level. We want to have a healthy fertility trend for our country because that means we have enough next generation. And when fertility trends go down, we have the aging issue, right? Where it's going to be more people who are elderly than they are the next generation, just like examples of Japan, Korea, for example. Now, they are trying to make people have more children. And then we also see an example of, for example, China, who have implemented one-child policies, two-child policies. So whether or not this fits our country is such a difficult question. Of course, I cannot answer, but we must think about what the implications are in terms of making a decision for our citizens and how much autonomy we want to give people in terms of deciding for their lives. So I think it's also a slippery slope in terms of trying to figure out whether we can create policies in terms of family planning. But what we can do and what's I think we should do a lot more on is to educate people about family planning and reproductive health, which is lacking. And I know this also from my research work on period poverty or menstrual poverty, is that we don't teach people the right information and the right knowledge about reproductive health so that they can understand the implication of their reproductive health throughout their lives. Not just, that one talk that your parents give you or your teachers or the school provides about your reproduction in the beginning, right? To tell you what your periods are, but also for people to be able to access knowledge and to have the right education about reproductive health throughout their reproductive life, meaning to say from the very beginning of menarche, first period, to the very end of menopause, right? Because a lot of changes happen during this time, but maybe people don't know a lot about. And this is not just like in the urban context, but also rural context, because we have findings where there are girls and even women who have had children who still don't have the correct idea about what a menstrual cycle is, how people have children, how it happens, and what are potential family planning or contraceptions that are available, and what are the risks of these contraceptions and how to use them. So even basic information like this, where we might think is everybody should know, is still not accessible to all. So I suppose we can start first with educating our people about reproductive health and contraception.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I think we have like a few more here. Dr. Sharifah.
Let's go.
From Hashim Lim. I think she said thank you for the talk. I enjoyed the point shared immensely. I am particularly interested in the urban-rural divide. Okay, do you think that physical infrastructures, development, or investment can help to bridge this gap? For instance, better transportation, connectivity, or broadband internet. Yeah.
Okay, so quite a broad question. Maybe we can try to look at some examples. Perhaps I'll try to give some examples. The rural and urban divide is related to the infrastructure, but also related to other things that might not be so material as well. So yes, when we talk about rural and urban divide in Malaysia, there are infrastructural issues. For example, ensuring that there is access to, in our context, a lot of questions about transportation, connectivity, and broadband. And I'm sure ensuring that these facilities are available will help in terms of, for example, ensuring that children can go to school easily, right? That it's not such a difficult thing for children to go to school, have access to medical care, for example, and of course, access to internet in this world that we live in. The digital divide is also affected by access to internet, access to the gadgets and things like that. But also the rural and urban divide in Malaysia is also access to employment, access to income, right? And also quality of services that are provided and available because of the difference. And then we also know that when we say the rural and urban divide, we're not just putting it on a hierarchy that the rural life is better or that the urban life is better, but it's recognizing that there is differences and diversity of life in the rural area and also in the urban area. The challenges of poverty in the urban area looks different, and the challenges of poverty in the rural area looks different. So for example, in the context of poverty in the urban area, perhaps there is access to clean water, access to better employment chances because there's a lot more potential employment to take on. But life in the urban area means that you need to make a higher income to survive, right? You must send your children to school. You can't grow your own food, right? If you live in the PPR, for example, which you could do in the rural areas. In the rural areas, you can grow your own food, for example. There are still instances where children don't go to school, for example, which is not something positive, but that happens. So generally, it's recognizing that life in the rural setting is different and life in the urban setting is different. And the challenges for those in poverty in those settings are also different. And so when we want to talk about poverty and poverty elevation, we must also look at that context as well, the rural context and the urban context. And then your suggestions obviously are important in trying to ensure that we elevate people in poverty and improve their quality of life in the rural context.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sharifah. All right, I think we have to go to the next question by Aisha Orlando. Assalamualaikum, Doctor. I would like to hear from your opinion. Do you believe the federal-state relation, patronage, and the resources cursed might contribute to the state of poverty? Thank you, Aisha.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I cannot see
The question is,
Okay.
I think, do you believe the federal-state relation, patronage, and the resources cursed might contribute to the state of poverty?
To be honest, I don't have enough information on the question. I'm sure in terms of our policy implementation, it would have an effect on it. But I don't know how far the effects are at the moment because it's really not something within my area.
Yeah, thank you. All right. I think, yeah, Aisha, I think that would be out of the area of Sharifah. Thank you for your question anyway. I think we move to the another question here by Muhammad Azri Syafwan. Okay, dengan izin ya in Malay. Okay, saya tertarik dengan perkataan stigma yang disebut oleh penyelidik. Ini punca kepada kemiskinan berulang dan kemiskinan kekal. Melalui pengalaman saya berdepan dengan pesalah dadah setiap minggu, stigma di kalangan orang awam menyebabkan kejatuhan kembali. Adakah satu usaha dari pihak penyelidik untuk mewujudkan satu kesedaran terhadap orang awam untuk memahami apa itu poverty ataupun kemiskinan? Kemiskinan adalah satu isu besar yang perlu diberikan perhatian kerana faktor kemiskinan ini datang dari pelbagai sudut. Okay, thank you very much. A good question from Azri. I think how he
I get a lot of good questions
yeah,
today.
yeah, interesting. Yes.
Thank you to the
Want to respond?
participant.
Yes.
Terima kasih banyak-banyak Cik Azri soalan yang baik sebenarnya dan juga perspektif yang penting lah untuk kita ketengahkan. Saya respon juga dalam bahasa Melayu ataupun I should respond in English. Tak apa, saya cuba Okay. Apa ni soalannya, adakah usaha dari pihak saya untuk mewujudkan kesedaran terhadap orang awam? Sebaik mungkin saya cubalah sebagai individu, mungkin kebolehan saya untuk mengadvokasikan ataupun memberi kesedaran tentang isu kemiskinan ni adalah something yang memang minat saya lah untuk bicarakan isu tentang kemiskinan dan mungkin salah faham tentang isu kemiskinan. Saya cuba sebaik boleh, tapi saya rasa lebih baik kalau usaha kesedaran tentang stigma kemiskinan ni kita jalankan sama-sama. Mungkin satu usaha yang boleh kita ketengahkan lah. Okay, boleh jawab in English ya. Okay, I think when we talk about advocacy and public education or uplifting our nation in terms of the public sentiments, it's really important that it happens from the grassroots. Although a lot of the times kita buat things from top bottom kan, but really changing sentiments is not an easy task because it requires us to educate people and also recognize why people have certain beliefs. Sometimes these beliefs may be brought about by certain types of social division kan, maksudnya we are distant from one another. Sebelum ni we use the term social distance for COVID kan. Actually in sociology or social sciences, social distance is a different measurement
Yeah.
of how far or how close we are from a group that may be different from us. It could be social distance from different ethnicities, for example, right? How close a particular community is, or how cohesive we are with each other when we look at people from different ethnicities. And in this context, people who are different from us, perhaps socioeconomic level. Okay, contohnya, for example, do we have spaces in our living? This is a bit of a controversial question, tapi tak apa, to give an idea of social distance too and socioeconomic differences is in terms of where people live. Do people from different socioeconomic levels live in the same space? Right? The closer we live with each other, the more likely we are to interact with each other, closing the gap of that distance. But the more separated we are in terms of even things like living, the more likely we are to feel that that's a different group. We are more likely to other dia. Maksudnya kita differentiate kan dia from our group. So we say, tu orang macam tu, kita orang ni, kita lain, macam tu kan. But if we live close to each other, we're likely to meet each other. Therefore, we have to get to know one another, and we are more likely to understand each other better. So that's why I say starting from the grassroots is important from people's day-to-day life in terms of our willingness and also our ability to interact and learn about other people who are different from us, and for us who perhaps can advocate for or explain and educate our people so that we can change the sentiments from the bottom. While the top-bottom too is important, the top-bottom communication, how the poor are being talked about. For example, we talk about poverty and stigma, kan? How we talk about stigma at the upper levels and how that cascades down, that's really important too. For example, people who are in the upper parts of society, for example, our leaders, our academics, how they talk about poverty will cascade down. That's really strong. But also at the grassroots, we also have to change the sentiment at the grassroots, and this really requires advocacy at different spaces.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. I think that will be the last questions for today. I think I would like to thank Dr. Sharifah Fatimah Al-Zahrah binti Said Hussein for the insightful and engaging lecture. We are really fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from you, I think, since this morning, and we have learned more about families in poverty, a sociological perspective. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us and for your attentions and participation throughout the lectures. You have shared a good question. Thank you, those who asked questions. And then I think this session is truly enriching discussion that we have today. Maybe before we end, I would like to remind you that I think you can have your e-certificate from the Secretariat by tomorrow. And lastly, I would like to extend my thanks to the organizer, Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, Universiti Malaya Kuala Lumpur, of today's lecture series for making this event possible. I think we hope to see you all again soon at the next guest lecture. And thank you and very much and have a great day ahead. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you for
Nafisa.
joining us. All right. Look forward for the next public lectures organized by Ungku Aziz Development Study Center, inshallah. Thank you.